Me great pleasure in introducing our next speaker, Professor Dale Purves from Duke University. Dr. Purves had a long and glorious career studying vision and visual perception, and boy are we lucky that he chose to study music and decided to turn his attention to this problem a few years ago. And in keeping with the theme of this summer school, which is dynamics of music and language, Dale's recent work has been trying to relate why things sound pleasant to us, why certain musical sounds sound nice to us, while some other things sound scary. And he's made a very difficult and interesting connection, which is hard to establish, between how things sound and their relationship to human speech. And today he's going to try and draw a very important connection in his talk between music, language, and speech, drawing from a number of recent studies that he's done on this topic. So without further ado, welcome Dr. Dale Purves.
Well, first of all, thanks, Ramesh and the committee for inviting me. I mean, this is a real treat for me, not only to be in Yosemite, I've never been here before, but also to learn as much or more as you guys as I hear these talks and discussions today and tomorrow night. So let me say a little bit more about where I'm coming from in this to add to what Ramesh said. I'm a neuroscientist, and for the last 15 years I've been interested, I've been doing many things before that, but for the last 15 years I've been interested in vision. And the thing that I've been mainly interested in is why it is that after 50 years of intense study of the details of the visual system, no one can really explain why we see what we do. And my take on that has been that the missing link in that problem has been a failure to really appreciate what the problems are in visual perception and how they're related to the circuitry of the visual system. Well, that's of course a story for another day or another course entirely, but I say that by way of indicating that when you get interested in one sensory modality and a principle that underlies that modality, and I think there are principles that underlie sensation, you get interested in another, and the obvious other is audition. And as Ramesh said, I've been interested in that actually for about 10 years now. And that's not my day job. I'm not a trained musician. I've never taken a course in music theory. You'll probably catch me making some boo-boos, that's okay. Call my attention if you do. But if you're interested in any sensory modality, you have to really be interested in explaining some phenomenology. And in audition, there's an enormously rich phenomenology dating back centuries, if not millennia, and that phenomenology is called music. So what I'm going to talk to you today about, if I can find my clicker here, is work carried out by a number of people. And I put this first because I don't want to forget to acknowledge and have trouble doing that as I go along and get involved in what I'm saying. The tremendously talented colleagues who've been involved in this, and the ones in red are the musical contingent, the ones in black are the visual contingent. And I'm going to talk especially about work that's been carried out by Dan Bowling, Janvi Sudarajan, and Hans Schweyer, as well as some older work carried out by David Schwartz and Cameron Gill. So, what is music? Obviously, this is the underlying question in all of the talks and discussions that we are having here. If you look it up in the OED, there's some bland definition of it, such as the one you see here, the art or science of combining vocal or instrumental sounds with a view towards beauty or coherence of form and the expression of emotion. So, you know, you ask different people or read different dictionaries, there'll be different definitions. But that's a fairly standard one. And it's obvious from what you know and from what people have already said that music in this definition or any other similar definition includes a bunch of stuff: tempo, rhythm that you just heard about, intensity, timbre, tonality. And the one I'm going to talk about is tonality. And this is one that I think is, in many ways, the essence of music: tones and tonal relationships. And the reason I knew the answer to Mark's question yesterday was that I actually included this slide of a 35,000-year-old Bourbon flute. And what he did mention is that not only does music go back a long way, of course, that's just the, as he said, the archaeological record with hundreds of thousands of years, no doubt. But what's interesting about this, and was not said, is that the separation of the holes on these artifacts suggests that people were playing the same scales then as they are now, and I'm going to talk a good deal about that. So here are the topics that I'm going to cover. I'm going to break the talk up into more or less these segments, and I'll stop between them, and you can have a chance to ask questions as we go along. I'm first going to talk about the definition of tones and why our sense of tonality evolved. As a neuroscientist, I'm basically coming at this from a biological interest. Why do we have a sense of tonality in a biological framework? Then I'm going to talk about the presence of a chromatic scale in human vocalization, and I'll say why I'm doing that when I come to that section. The basis of consonance and dissonance. A very interesting question: why a few musical scales are universal, why people around the globe, well, there are many exceptions to the rules, but the general rule is they're using the same basic stuff to make music, formally speaking. And then what aspects of music vary across cultures. It's obvious that cultures have different musical traditions, and if you go into a Chinese restaurant, you hear music that sounds different than you hear when you turn on your golden oldies radio station. And finally, I'm going to talk about wide scales that convey different emotions, and the theme of all of this, and all of these are linked, in my estimation, as biological phenomena. That may sit well with some of you, may not sit well with others who think that music is, much more widely embedded in culture, aesthetics, and things that don't reduce to biology. But I think what I'm going to argue is that many of the things that we really need to focus on in understanding music are fundamentally biological. So let's begin with the first of these issues, tones, and why our sense of tonality evolved. So you probably all know this, but just in case some of you don't, tones have a particular definition, and they are defined across a spectrum of sound stimuli that ranges from sine tones, which is what a tuning fork produces. That is, if you tune your instrument to a concert A, you're producing only one frequency by the vibration of the tines of the tuning fork. And if you look at the signal that's coming and recordable from the fork, it's a series of amplitude vibrations that have a single spectral frequency, 440 hertz, whatever it might be. The other extreme is white noise. White noise, and this is an example of Gaussian white noise that I just grabbed off Wikipedia. White noise is the extreme in which every frequency is represented more or less equally. And that's what you hear when your TV set is not picking up your cable, whatever. It just is a sound that includes basically all frequencies in more or less equal amounts. So tones are a special subset along this continuum, and they're the subset that, first of all, starts with the fact that we hear repeating sound stimuli, and periodic sound stimuli are the essence of tones. We hear them from about 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz. Again, I think all of you probably know this or have heard this. but tones, in the sense of music, have a much more limited range. And they range from about 70 hertz to maybe a few thousand hertz, depending on who you're listening to, what instrument you're playing, etc. So one needs to ask, where does this sense of tonality come from? Why do we have it? Any sense that we have, any sensory modality, any subset of that sensory modality, any quality that we perceive, whether it's vision, audition, or whatever, has a reason, a good biological reason. And tonality is our sense of higher or lower pitch in response to periodic stimuli. The reason I asked Laurel that question is I think there is a difference between what a sine tone is doing, which is a very unnatural stimulus, and what we hear when we talk about pitch. And pitch needs to be distinguished between the pitches that we hear in music, which, as I said, range from about 70 hertz, that is the fundamental frequency of a harmonic series, ranges from about 70 hertz to maybe 5,000, 6,000 hertz. We hear up to 20,000 hertz. We call those things pitches. They're not musical tones. They're tones such as a siren would make when you hear the ambulance go by, and many other sound sources. They're periodic, they're repeating, they have a spectral frequency, but they're not musical. So tonality is rather a special sense, at least in the context of music. And the pitch relationships, of course, are the basis of harmony and melody. That's why I say it's the essence of music. I mean, this is not to diminish rhythm, intensity, all of these other factors that go into the determination of what we hear and appreciate in music. But tonality is clearly a huge part of it. And much of music theory entails trying to understand tonality as it's expressed in music. And tones are not just limited to music. I asked an earlier question about tone languages. So a lot of the languages of the 6,000 or 7,000 that are out there in the world today use tones specifically to identify lexical meanings. So Mandarin, Thai, Vietnamese, and so on are tone languages and are using tones not in a musical sense, but in a very critical lexical sense for those linguistic traditions. And I'll talk more about that later. In music, of course, and this will be much of what I'm going to focus on, the tones have particular arrangements, and that's kind of weird. Why is that? Why do they have these arrangements? So a lot of what I'm going to talk about is trying to answer or address at least part of the answer to what that question suggests. So where does our sense of tonality come from? Well, this is, I think, really fundamental to all of the issues that I'm talking about here. The main point in this slide is that pretty much the only tonal sound in the definition that I've given you that's out there in the human environment, and I don't mean today, I mean from day one in the evolution of our species, the only tones that are out there in nature are animal tones. And those tones can be human vocalizations, they can be frogs, they can be birdsong, they can be the stridulation of insects. I live in a place where there are lots of cicadas, and in the summer those are deafening periodic sounds. But the ones that really count for us, and the predominant vocalizations that we hear every day in abundance, are the tones uttered by the vocalizations of our fellow human beings. And it's important to differentiate in thinking about that. This is not necessarily speech. I mean, obviously, I'm going to talk mostly about speech, but prelingual vocalizations are just as important. And if you go back to thinking about the origins of music and speech, of course, there must have been an enormously long period before the advent of speech as we know it. And think about it today, when prelingual vocalizations of all sorts, I mean the oohs, the ahs, the ughs, all the sounds that we still make all the time, were critical in understanding our relationships to our fellow humans. And the argument that I'm making here is that our sense of tonality arose from the biological utility of identifying human vocalizations. I think you already heard a little bit about how important vocalizations are in the sense of the information that's conveyed. Not lexical information, but just the physical characteristics of what we hear from the physical characteristics of those stimuli tell us the size of the person, the gender of the person, the emotional state of the person. And this is obviously biologically critical. So a corollary, and this is of course old news, is that musical tones and speech are very likely to be intimately related. So I think David yesterday mentioned the review by Justin and Lauka from 2003 that describes hundreds, literally, of papers that are on this subject. And, you know, people from antiquity have recognized that there is a link between music and vocalization or speech. But the things that I'm going to focus on today, and that have not been so well explained, are the tonal characteristics of speech, the notes that we use in music, why we use them, how we hear their relationships. That's the focus, and the argument is going to be that they are biological in origin as well. So to get into that, I need to tell you a little bit more about the nature of the production of speech. Again, most of you, or many of you, will know this, but maybe not everybody. So here's a diagram of the human vocal tract. And you can think of this in a very simple way, and people have pretty much since the middle of the 19th century, as a vibrating source, the vocal cords in the larynx, and you can feel this vibration very easily. If you go or e and put your finger on your Adam's apple, you can feel the vibration that's coming from the vocal cords. That vibration is analogous to plucking a string or blowing a string on a musical instrument. And like the musical instrument, that vibration is modified, as you heard a little bit about yesterday, by the rest of the vocal tract. And this is critical. So the distinction that's made between the vowels that enable us to understand language come from this modulation of the fundamental sound, which is a harmonic series coming from the larynx, from the vocal cords, the shape that's dynamically under neural control, changing all the time as we talk. That's critical in determining what comes out of your mouth. And what's been the sort of standard model of this is Johannes Müller in the 19th century kind of put this idea on the map, is the so-called source filter model of speech sound production. So here's we're looking down on the vocal cords and the vibrating source, and that vibrating source is producing a harmonic series. Again, if you don't remember this, let me remind you that a harmonic series is what happens when you pluck a string. String vibrates at its full length, that's the fundamental frequency. It also vibrates in a mode that's half that length, a third that length, a quarter that length, and so on, to create a series of integer multiples of the fundamental. That is what you see here when you plot the amplitude of the sound that's produced against the frequency. You get a whole series of these integer multiples that's called a harmonic series, and that if you put a microphone down at the level of the language, of the larynx, this is exactly what you see. This is the resonant frequency of the vocal tract above the larynx, and although it's dynamically modified all the time as we speak, it has a basic characteristic that is demonstrated here or illustrated here based on the odd harmonics of a tube that's about 17 centimeters in length in us adults, and a tube just physically closed at one end that's of that length will generate harmonics at 500, 1500, 2500 hertz, very roughly. And that resonance, just like the resonance of the violin or the guitar or whatever instrument you want to consider, modifies the harmonic series that's coming from the plucked string or the wind instrument, what's happening at the reed, etc. It modifies it so that what comes out of the mouth is a modified harmonic series in a very special way. And as I said, it's modified so that we can understand by the position of these peaks in the amplitude of the foam that comes out of the mouth what the vowel is. These are called formants. This is the first formant, this peak, the second formant, the third formant. And the relationship between the formants, mainly the first and the second, determine whether we're saying A, E, I, O, U, etc. So this is characteristic of all languages and is sort of the basic way in which the vocal tract is producing the tonal sounds that we hear. So that's, like I said, sort of a primer on where tonality comes from. The argument is that it comes from, of course, the environment, the information we need to glean from the environment, and the information that we need to glean most especially is information about other human beings. Why? Because that's critically important in running away from an angry foe, finding a mate, etc., etc., etc. I mean, we're doing this all the time, and I think that's a pretty straightforward way of thinking about why we have a sense of tonality in the first place. So that's kind of the basis for what I'm going to say in the next several segments, and maybe we can just pause there for a second and see if you have any questions. I mean, this is background essentially, so don't feel obliged to ask me a question unless there's something you don't understand. Yeah.
This isn't a question, but could you please turn off the program that is making alerts in the background? It's very.
Turn off the.
There's something that's being passed into the audio system that has a bunch of alerts. They're going ping and.
Oh, you mean this thing?
I don't know. No.
It's the laser pointer.
Yeah.
It's the laser pointer.
Laser pointer.
Maybe just mute the computer.
Yeah.
It's very distracting.
I want to use the laser pointer, so I don't know. I don't know what I can
I don't
do.
think people can see the laser pointer. I can hurt us.
Okay, well then I will use my finger and stop using the laser pointer. Okay, any questions other than technical comment? Sorry?
If you just mute the laptop, that'll do it.
Move the...
Mute.
Just mute the sound on your laptop and it should.
Oh, mute the sound on the laptop. Well, I need to use the... Yeah, okay. Good suggestion. Too much trouble. Okay, so the first substantive topic that I want to talk about is the chromatic scale in speech. And this is work that really was the first thing we did, starting an investigation of musical phenomenology back about 10 years ago now. And I first need to tell you, again, what probably most all of you know, certainly the musical background people here know, which is what the chromatic scale is. The chromatic scale means a ladder. I mean, that's the root in Latin. And the scale starts from a low note, unison, this is a C major scale, and climbs this ladder over a series of 12 tones until it reaches the octave, which is a doubling of the fundamental frequency in the harmonic series that I showed you just a minute ago. So those 12 tonal intervals are the stuff of music worldwide. This is the set from which people draw, whether they're whatever culture they come from. There are some exceptions, and I think we'll hear something about some of these exceptions as we go along, and they're interesting. But the basic reality is that people worldwide are drawing from this set of 12 tones to make music. By the way, does anybody know where the word octave comes from? Octave means a doubling of the fundamental frequency that's used in physics. I mean, people talk about, stuff completely different than music and sound in terms of octaves. Anybody know where the word octave comes from?
The word 8.
Yes, of course, it comes from the word 8, but where does 8 come from? These are 12 tones.
It's the 8th note in the diatonic scale.
Exactly. So octave comes from music. It comes from the fact that, as we'll see, there are preferred 8 notes of this complete set of 12, which is the chromatic scale, which is why the prefix oct is attached to it. So these divisions of the chromatic scale are called semitones. There are 12 of them, and each semitone is, depending on the tuning system that you were using, pretty much a 6% increment over the previous tone. So, as you know, I mean, frequency, if you're in the middle range of hearing, frequencies have one sort of separation, and if you're in a higher range, they have a bigger separation in terms of hertz, and you have to allow for that by normalizing, so that's why this is specified in percentage rather than in hertz. So why is that? Why would people use these 12 divisions of an octave to make music? So I'll come back later and tell you that there are, of course, innumerable divisions that we human beings could have made over an octave. We could discriminate about 240 different pitch intervals. We just take a sine tone and turn it up and ask us a normal subject, when does the sound, when can you differentiate that the sound is now a different pitch than the original? You can differentiate a whole lot of divisions over an octave. Why do we use 12? Well, that's a fundamental question that I will come to. But this initial study was to ask, is it the case, based on what I said before, that the chromatic scale is really embedded in the vocalizations that we humans and beings are making all the time? So if you want to answer that question, I mean, that would be a good starting point in thinking about why tonality has the characteristics it does, why we use the chromatic scale, why we use subsets of that, of a particular sort to make music, how this varies between cultures and so on. So step one in this is to ask and answer the question, is the chromatic scale embedded in the vocalizations that we make all the time? So for that you need a database, and the database that we use is called the TIMIT database. It's widely used by linguists. TIMIT stands for Texas MIT Corpus. It's called the TIMIT Corpus. And it's a wonderfully compiled standard set of speech sounds that we or anybody else can analyze. And in doing this, so here is just a speech sound signal. Again, I need to emphasize to you that there's a difference, for those of you who don't think about these things all the time, between a signal in time and a spectrum. Spectrum is taking a slice in time and asking what the frequency power distribution is. A signal in time is just the amplitude of the signal varying over some period of time. So this is the signal. I think this is the sentence, I forget exactly what it was, but something like, he had your washing in greasy water all week, or something trivial like that. It was meaningless emotionally. And you can take segments of speech from that, thousands of them, and compile them and ask, when you take their spectrum, so here's a 50 millisecond segment. Here's the spectrum, the slice, the power distribution over that slice. This is basically a harmonic series, which is, of course, what you are getting. This would be in the first format. And you can then ask over a compilation of thousands of these. Sorry, I told you that wrong. This is not the spectrum. This is just the taking this and blowing it up in time. This is the spectrum. This would be the first harmonic. This would be the second harmonic, and so on. Sorry. So the name of this game is to ask, as I suggested, is the chromatic scale evident in a very large number of speech segments analyzed in this way? So we don't need really to talk about the details of this, but on the upper left is the raw data of 60,000 segments. Their spectra normalized so that you're asking what's the distribution of power when you normalize each segment to the maximum and explore what the subsequent distributions of power are in that speech overall. This is a fancy way of just saying you're asking what the distribution of power is in speech. And this is the result of that average over 3 octaves, so 1 to 2, 2 to 4, 4 to 8. And what you see here, what I'll come back to in detail, is that this is the unison, and then there's a series of bumps here. And this is the octave, so this is just the first octave of these 3 octaves that are shown up here on the left. And on the lower right is males and females to indicate that you see this pretty much whether you're looking at one gender or the other. And the point of this is that if you look at the bumps and ask, what are those bumps in terms of musical ratios? What are the bumps in terms of the chromatic scale? It turns out that they include all of the intervals in the chromatic scale. So what you see here, this is again C major scale shown on a piano keyboard. These are the frequencies of each of the bumps, just indicated in terms of musical terminology. And all of the chromatic scale tones are there as bumps. They are salient in the speech that we hear, or the vocalizations that we hear all the time. So if you look closely at this, you probably notice, well, there are not 12 bumps there, really there are only 9. That's because the major second and the major seventh are in the next octave, the number 2 octave that I showed you in the previous slide. The only one that's missing in this is the minor second. And the reason the minor second doesn't show up is that its ratio is very close to here, and it's lost in the huge amplitude of the power at unison and the octave, and you just don't see it. It's in there someplace, but you don't see it. Yeah.
Sorry, these are intervals? These are intervals?
Yeah.
Frequency intervals?
Yes.
Okay.
So the ratios of the intervals are shown, I don't know whether you can see them here, but these are the intervals shown as frequency ratios. Here the chromatic frequency ratios. Here you can see that these correspond to these.
I was actually interested in how the ratios are measured, how the interval is measured in speech.
How they're measured in speech?
Right.
Well, this is the preceding slide that I showed you. So in the upper left, this is 60,000 segments. The segments are all normalized to the maximum amplitude in each segment, and then
Amplitude normalized or frequency normalized?
amplitude, to the maximum amplitude. And then you ask, well, when you maximize, I mean, you've got to normalize them in some way. When you normalize all the segments, what's the distribution of power? And these are the bumps that I'm showing you here.
But there must be a frequency normalization.
There must be a frequency normalization if you're looking at an interval. If you're looking at intervals.
Well, we're looking at one octave. Yeah, the frequency, I guess, is normalized in one octave.
But it goes, but so, you know, you're looking at, you know, one at unison, at an octave, at a fifth, and so forth.
Yeah.
So those must be normalized according to, I mean, these can't be absolute frequencies.
No, they're not absolute frequencies. Yes.
So it was that detail that I was.
Yeah. So, again, the point of this is that the question that was asked is, could it be that the reason for using these 12 intervals of the chromatic scale worldwide to make music, could it be that it's because they're in speech? They're there as salient features of the speech that we hear all the time. And the answer to that question seems to be yes. So let's pause there and discuss some more what questions you might have at this point, because this is kind of critical. Again, if you take all 12 of those, what we're going to turn to next is, you take all 12 of those intervals and try to make music of it, you'll have atonal music that, you know, Schoenberg and Weber and others have made their fame on, but most people really don't like it. And it's the diatonic 7-note scales and the pentatonic 5-note scales that are characteristic of folk music that are the stuff of music today. So let me pause there. Let you ask questions. Yeah.
The question I guess I would have is more of a philosophical question, and that would be, why are those intervals in speech? Might there be a deeper principle?
That's a good question. Just thinking, I have a slide at the end that shows that, but let me just tell you that the reason that they're there in speech, I don't think there's a deeper principle, but the reason that they're there in speech is that, remember the formants that I showed you. So the maximum power in speech is not at the first formant. If you take, and this is the slide that I don't want to go to the trouble to find at the end of the pile here and show you, but if you look at the distribution of the harmonics that are occurring most frequently in speech, it's the 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th. And the ratios of those harmonics are the ones that will generate all of these tones with respect to the fundamental.
So it's the structure of the harmonic series.
Yeah, but it's not the harmonic series because, I mean, another control that was done was to ask, could you get these if you just analyzed harmonic series? And the answer is no, you don't get these intervals if you just analyze a harmonic series. You have to have the specific prevalences of the harmonics that are in speech, the maximum harmonic, salient harmonics in speech being basically the 4th, 5th, and 6th. So it's in speech. It's not just blather about a harmonic series, and that's really important. Other questions? Yeah.
I'm having a philosophical problem.
I think questions are philosophical.
So the picture here is in the frequency domain. But what you're showing is a time domain series. I mean, the scale is a time domain by definition.
This is that's a normalized spectrum of the segments in speech.
Right.
When you say time domain, you don't mean a time signal in, sound signal in time.
Well, I mean, the scale is a sound signal in time. The scale rarely occurs as a moment.
Well, we'll talk about scales in a bit, So, you know, you have melody and harmony. Harmony is basically notes played together, and melody is notes played sequentially. So when you say the scale, I mean, the scale applies to both, but more about the simultaneity of harmonies than the sequence of melodies. So this is a spectrum, and it has to do with just showing that the chromatic scale intervals are there in speech, nothing more than that at this point. But we'll come to scales in a minute, and maybe you want to hold your question until we address the other issue, which is, or another issue in this series, which is why do we like these particular scales, and why is it that we really don't like the entire dodecatonic scale, the chromatic scale? Yeah.
How long were the segments in this long-term average?
I think there were 50 milliseconds. You have to have enough of an interval to pick up so you don't get biasing by aliasing from a Nyquist, a misapplied Nyquist frequency. You need enough to get 3 cycles of the lowest fundamental that you're interested in. And I think it was 50 milliseconds, it might have been.
I think your graph said 100.
Sorry?
I think it said 0.1.
Okay, well then it's 100. Yeah.
I'm wondering if you've ever, I think it's really interesting. I'm not familiar with this stuff before, I love it, but have you ever done, or has anybody looked at the power distribution of non-human vocalizations? And this might address something like what Ed, who's not here now, was saying, that there could be some function of mammalian vocalizations, and then there's a coevolution of the production system and perceptual systems that also have constraints that have to do with auditory scene analysis, like Laurel talked about, and that music is derived from that coevolutionary process, and that you should, by that view, you should see it in other mammalian vocal systems.
You wouldn't see this in any other mammalian species, but there's precious little work on this. So there are people like Asif Ghazanfar at Princeton who's looking at monkey vocalizations and asking, you know, are the monkey vocalizations the coos and the various sounds that they use socially for pre-lingual kinds of information?
But they have format structure and similar.
They do, but it's not the same. I mean, their vocal tracks are so different than ours that it's not the same. Both the length, the resonance properties.
But I wonder if you'd find some other kind of scale in there, perhaps. There might be some musical-like features that might...
Well, nobody's looked and they don't do music, so...
Well, just because they don't do music doesn't mean they don't have the pre-capacity for some sort of acoustical...
Yeah, no, it's an interesting
sensitivity.
Yeah.
I just want to make, sorry, I have a technical question again. I want to make sure I'm understanding the relationship between the frequencies we're seeing here and the fundamental frequency and harmonics of the fundamental and formant frequency in speech that you talked about earlier.
Yeah.
So in this plot, the very first large peak that we see, what would that correspond to?
Oh, well, I don't want to use my pointer. I know you can see it anyway. So that's unison. That's the tonic note. That's the power that's at, by definition in this analysis, the maximum power in the spectrum of the normalized speech sounds. And every other bump follows from that.
Okay.
It's a bump in relation to the maximum, over one octave.
So, okay, yeah, so that wouldn't be necessarily the fundamental frequency, it would just be whatever.
It's not the fundamental frequency. That's not really the fundamental frequency. Like I said a minute ago, the maximum powers of the fifth, sixth, fourth, fifth, and sixth usually.
So you're aligning those?
Yeah, you align to the maximum. That's, you have to normalize it, otherwise you can't do anything with it.
So would it correspond to the peak frequency then?
Not the peak frequency, just the peak power. I mean, the frequency, if it's the fifth harmonic, it's whatever the frequency of the fifth harmonic is in school. Other questions, yeah?
So I notice here that your comparison is with the just intonation for these
intervals. Oh yeah, I meant to mention that, yeah, go ahead.
Have you compared the alignment? Is alignment better for just intonation than the alignment for equal temperament?
Okay, so let's go back to that. I meant to say something about that. So, again, I don't know whether you can all see this in the back, but what are represented in the three columns to the right are just intonation, equal temperament tuning, and Pythagorean tuning. Pythagorean tuning, the rightmost column, is tuning using perfect fifths. And you can do that, but nobody basically does. You can, on the left, use all of the small number of frequency ratios for your tuning, and a lot of people did do that until about the 16th century. And then with the low-tempered clavier and other, I mean, that really wasn't the right history of when it all changed, but the recognition that you wanted to play in different keys and make music much more variable than just playing in one octave, equal temperament came into being and is now the stuff of music every place. Equal temperament is a compromise where you make the semitone fit into an octave by making each semitone exactly the same so that they are equal. And you can then make instruments and play those instruments over in any key, transitioning from any key over as many octaves as you like without having to do any retuning. So it's equal temperament is kind of the way of today, but it wasn't always the way.
So in comparing the distribution of ratios out of speech, is the comparison then specifically?
Well, you can see that the ratios are very, very similar. I mean, there are just a few minor differences whether you're using Pythagorean equal temperament. And these are important or just intonation. So they're important in music, and there's always been a big debate about whether just intonation, and I think it's right, is the natural way. And people will say, well, just intonation, music played in just intonation tuning sounds brighter and a little bit more natural than equal temperament. Well, I can't hear it, but maybe, trained musicians can.
But then if you looked at it more carefully, I think the question is for the just intonation because it's more natural and it wasn't something that humans messed with and created an artificial system like equal temperament tuning. If you looked at the alignment between the two spectra, you should see a marginally better fit.
Yeah. So this analysis that I'm talking about is in just intonation.
So all of these you presented is for just intonation?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Any other questions at this point? Okay, let's talk about consonance and dissonance. So, this is, again, a debate that spans millennia. And I don't know what's touching what here, but I'm trying to keep my head up. The question that's being asked is, what distinguishes tonal relationships that we like in music and tonal relationships that we like less or dislike? And lots of people have smashed their hammers on that sort of anvil, but it's a very hard question. And this is just the data. And again, if you can't see this, let me explain it to you, that this graph on the abscissa is the interval name, the 12 tones of the chromatic scale, and on the ordinate is the rank. That is, you ask a bunch of normal subjects which one do they like best compared to one of the other tones, and they eventually rank them. In these studies, you'll notice, I think there are 7 or 8 of them here, all date from early in the 20th century. I mean, this is not a current topic that people are devoting much time to, but they all come out pretty much the same way, and the red dotted line is the median of these several studies that were done, again, in late 19th and early 20th century. And everybody agrees that this is more or less the rank, that the most consonant tone is unison, or the octave, perfect fifth is next, perfect fourth is next, major third, and then on down through the list of chromatic intervals until you reach the right-hand end, where people find the major seventh and the minor second pretty unpleasant sounding, or less pleasant sounding. I shouldn't say unpleasant, because they all have their uses in music, but they're less appealing than the ones on the left-hand side of the scale. So that's consonance ranking. Everybody more or less, there's a lot of variation. Different instruments were used, different numbers of people, different whatever. But you know, it comes out in a pretty straightforward sense of agreement among these different studies. And the question is, why does that exist? Why do we like some tones more than others? And again, consonance is a tricky word. I mean, just means we like it. I mean, you can put fancier definitions on it, but basically it's just what you like more than something else. So it's a subjective judgment. And the guy who put the definition that lasted for the better part of a century on the map was Hermann Helmholtz. I think David mentioned Helmholtz as well. I mean, he was really an incredible giant in science in the mid to late 19th century. His main work was in vision, but he made absolutely seminal contributions to thermodynamics and wrote a book that's readable and impressive today on audition. And his idea about consonance and dissonance, I mean, he was basically a physicist. And in fact, I think the history of auditory science over the 20th century has been, to a considerable degree, based on physics, and maybe to the detriment of progress. But no matter, Helmholtz's idea was fundamentally a physical one, and he observed that when two tones are near each other, so this is the signal coming from a C, and this is C sharp, so this is a minor second. And when you play these two tones together, they interfere with each other constructively and destructively, and you get, as a result, this variation. This again is amplitude, and this is just the signal in time. You get variation in the amplitude that is periodically repeating and is heard as bumpy or rough in Helmholtz's term. And he surmised that consonance and dissonance were just about the presence or absence of physical bumpiness in the sound. And lots of people accepted that at the time, although not everybody. And as I said, it lasted for the better part of a century in people's estimation of what consonance and dissonance was all about. However, a bunch of evidence began to seriously belie that, more modern evidence. One piece of evidence is that if you play the two tones, in the example I showed you, a C and a C sharp, put one in one ear and the other tone in the other ear, the bumpiness is very seriously diminished, but people still hear it as pretty much a dissonant tone. I think the person who has recently done good work with colleagues is Josh McDermott now at NYU, who's worked with Isabel Parents and others to show in a couple of studies that, for example, people with amusia, and there's a small contingent of people who were born, I think, again, somebody mentioned this in one of the previous talks, that there's a small percentage of people who just don't get music. They don't like it, they don't care about it, they don't hear any aspect of it that the rest of us hear as wonderful, and we want to hear more of it. And what he showed was, or what they showed was, that these amusics can perfectly well hear the bumpiness, and they don't like it, but they can't hear the consonants. In other words, it's a dissociation of bumpiness and consonants, and that's a paper that I think came out, I think sometime in the last year or so. Another study that they did also showed a dissociation between consonants and roughness or bumpiness in Helmholtzian terms. So it seems to be the case, based on dichotic listening or these studies that I just mentioned to you, that it's probably not, it's not a physical thing. It's not about just whether the sound that you hear is bumpy or not, or rough. It's something else. And so the biological interpretation that we've sort of flogged is that the consonance and dissonance, liking it or disliking it, just comes from the salience of the tone combinations in speech, or the lack of their salience in speech. So this comes back to the, well, let me show you on the next slide. So the argument here is that we like or dislike, or like less, a musical dyad, two tones played together. Remember that, you know, we're talking now about tonal dyads. An individual tone has no consonance or dissonance. Meaningless. Consonant and dissonant are meaningless with one tone. So this is about playing two tones together, a dyad. So the argument is that we like them because the ones that are consonant, or that we call consonant, have more information, more salient information about, is this sound a human speech sound, than a dissonant combination, or one that we judge to be dissonant, because they have less information, less salient information. So this is the same slide I showed you before. So here again, over one octave, the salience of the chromatic scale of bumps in this timid analysis of a very large number of speech segments. And so it's obvious that some of these bumps are bigger and some are smaller, and that's, in a sense, an index of their salience. And you can measure that in terms of their amplitude or their rate of rise, their slope. And this next slide, taken from that same 2003 paper, is just an indication of the salience, the amplitude, and the rate of rise, the slope, plotted in terms of consonance ranking. And the upshot of this is that whether you look at the slope or whether you look at the amplitude, the salience, both of these measures of salience go very well, or correlate very well with the plot that, you know, people determined in the early 20th century, late 19th century. So that's the argument that, you know, I think everybody agrees at this point that Helmholtz is wrong, but that doesn't answer the question of why, you know, some tone combinations are pleasant or more pleasant than others that are less pleasant. And our argument is simply that we like the ones that are salient because, a very simple biological reason. They tell us more directly and impressively whether a sound is a human speech sound or not. So that's the argument there. And let's stop again and take questions. Let me see how the time is going here. Take questions before going on to why some scales are universal, more or less. Questions?
Something occurs to me. Have you analyzed the, in the same way that you analyze speech sounds, any other resonant things that are sort of common? I mean, you mentioned other animals, but I wonder.
Well, they're not, so again, you're pretty limited. Remember what I said at the outset, and I think it's really key. that there are very few tonal sounds in nature. I mean, you have stereo sounds,
I see, yeah.
but you don't have much else. I mean, you go out with a microphone in nature, you just won't find tonal sounds unless you've got animals around, and human beings are the animals that are around us. So there's really nothing much you can, tie your analysis to.
But the vocal tract is just a tube that has flexible resonances, and there are other objects that may not be natural, but are going to have similar harmonic structure to them simply because they physically resemble. I mean, apart from
so you could
them being man-made, but
yeah. Well, that's an interesting question.
Okay.
Nobody's thought of that. So
I wonder if you tested like a corpus of clarinet tones, if it would have similar frequency normalized and amplitude normalized, if it would have similar bumps in it.
Well, that's a good question. Yeah. I might be right to it. Yeah, no, that's an interesting question. Yeah, I haven't thought of that. I think you would, but I'm sure it really is the case. Yeah.
If I get you right, you said that human speech is consonant, and that's how we identify it as human speech. So people with amusia would have difficulty with that. Would you go with that part?
Say it again. I'm a little deaf myself, which doesn't help me. One of the reasons I walk around.
I'm not sure I really got you, but on your last summary.
What makes it recognizable?
Right.
Well, again, remember that the basic characteristic of human speech is that it's a harmonic series. That's the definition of a tonal sound, and you just don't have many of those in nature except for human tonal sounds. And we like human tonal sounds for the reasons that are biologically, I think, pretty obvious. That's the argument.
And in amusia, we see...
Amusia, yeah, I mean, they just don't like music, so you could, there are lots of interesting questions to ask there, like, so would music have trouble speaking a tone language? I don't know, nobody's looked. I mean, these were recent studies done with Americans.
But but one would then also expect them to be less able to identify these consonant harmonic series in speech sounds, or appreciate them to a lesser extent or something.
Yeah, again, that wasn't part of the study, but I think that would be a logical prediction.
But they can struggle with emotional prosody.
Yeah, they should struggle.
They do.
Do they?
There's research on that.
So, I read these papers a few days ago, but you probably have a better sense of them than I do. So they struggle with emotional prosody. We'll come to that, and let's bring that point back. Is that okay? Other questions before I move on? Okay, so this is really an interesting question. You got the chromatic scale. I said before that there are billions, and I mean that literally, ways of combining 240 discriminations that we human beings can make over one octave. There are billions of ways you could combine those to make a 12-note scale, or many millions to make a 7-note scale, many millions, not many millions, tens of thousands to make a pentatonic scale. So those are enormous numbers. And yet, worldwide, and I'm going to show you some, well, try to convince you of this, there may be some opponents to the idea. Worldwide, we just use a few of those scales. And why is that? Why, over the enormous range of possibilities that we could have used to make scales, are we using subsets that are more than a handful, but in music today, I don't know, something well less than 100, I think, would be an estimate, and very much less than 100 if you take the really popular ones that are widely used. So, as I said, this number of 240 is pretty much agreed upon just from psychophysics of how many intervals, as you gradually increase the frequency of a sine tone, we can distinguish over an octave in the middle range of hearing. and that leads to enormous numbers of possible scales that, in principle, could have been used. So why do we just have a few? So in the upper rectangle are the pentatonic scales that are used today. On the left, the major pentatonic scale, the minor pentatonic scale. The Mangam scale is a Korean scale that's popular. The Ratusan scale is a South Indian scale that's popular. So these are all scales that are popular in some culture or another. And in the bottom rectangle, the heptatonic scales that are widely used around the world, including the major diatonic scale in its Greek terminology, the Ionian, the natural minor, the Aeolian in its Greek terminology, and the rest that you see there. These are the scales that are very, very widely used to make music. As we'll see in a bit, there are, of course, others, but as I say, I think a reasonable estimate is I don't know, less than 100. Out of billions. So, a possibility. So why is this? Well, first of all, let me convince you that very different cultures are basically using the same scale. They call them different things. They have different histories. But basically they're the same chromatic scale. So what I'm doing here is comparing the 12-tone system of Carnatic music. Carnatic music is classical South Indian music, and it's probably the best database that we have, or at least that we could find to study this issue in the world today of classical. By classical, I mean, I don't know what people mean when they say Western music, but by classical music, we're talking about music that antedates 1900, when, you know, people moved around a lot, radios came into being, and you couldn't possibly make this kind of analysis today because everybody's been exposed to Western pop music, and you can't go to remote places in the Amazon jungle or wherever and not hear, you know, the stuff that has contaminated the world's music. But in terms of classical music, if you compare the tonal intervals of classical South Indian music to the tonal intervals, the chromatic scale of classical Western music, and again, classical Western music, again, we know what that means, classical Western music has terminology or has a meaning that's already been used, but you can see that these scales are identical. They're both using the same tonal intervals, and the difference between, and we'll come to this in a bit, the difference between cultures really has more to do with the details of how the scale is used and the ornamentation that's added to the basic 12 tones or 8 tones or 5 tones than to anything that's really a major difference in the way music is used. So the question that's being asked in this little piece of the presentation is, why is that? Why does everybody like the same stuff? And the argument is, everybody likes the same stuff because everybody has the same vocal track. Everybody wants to know whether a sound is more or less indicative of a human vocalization. And that's true of scales just as well as it's true of dyads, what we talked about before in talking about consonance ranking. So it's a little trickier with scales because now you're dealing not with 2 notes, but with 8 notes or 7 notes or 12 notes, depending on what scale you're looking at. And so this is work done by Cameron Gill a few years ago, wonderfully gifted musician, and sorry he's not around anymore to work with. So his idea was, okay, let's judge the whole scale. Let's take a pentatonic scale as an example, 5 notes. So there are about 40,000 possible 5-note scales that one could make with 240 distinctions over an octave. So let's ask how each one of those scales rates in terms of its similarity to a human vocalization. And the way that's done is for any given note in the scale, when you hear a low note, a high note, this is just one of the dyads in the scale, to take the harmonics, the red lines, the blue lines, of two notes that are one note in a pentatonic scale, combine them, and then ask how well do the red and blue lines fit a uniform harmonic series. Again, a uniform harmonic series being the critical defining characteristic of human vocalizations. So if you do this for every note in a scale, you get a speech similarity. And let me show you this in the next slide for the pentatonic scale. So here, here's a pentatonic minor scale. Just take it as an example of a widely used scale analyzed in this way. So here are all the component intervals in a minor pentatonic scale, and there are 15 of them, even though mathematically there's 72 possible combinations, but there are only 15 that are non-redundant. And here are the 15 non-redundant intervals in the pentatonic that make up the pentatonic scale, the minor pentatonic scale. And you take the speech percentage similarity in the way I just showed you for each note in the scale, add them up, and come to a value. And that's the overall similarity to a uniform harmonic series that identifies human speech for that scale. Okay, so when that's done for, in this case, what this graph is showing you, the details you don't need to see them, I'm sure you can, but this is showing the 50 heptatonic scales, 7-note diatonic scales that conform most closely to a harmonic series out of 40 million possibilities. It's a lot of possibilities. And look what happens here. So this is the top ranked one, second, third, fourth, down to the 60th here. Sorry, I'm using my pointer again. So all of these top ranked ones, the ones that are ranked at the very top, are all the scales that are in wide use today. And just in the first 60, you've eliminated practically everything. The Porto-Locrian scale, which is one of the classic Greek modes, is down here at number 60, and indeed it's a scale that basically, for a variety of reasons, basically nobody uses. So that's the evidence that, in my view, people like certain scales because of their similarity to speech. And if you analyze them in this way, the ones that come out of the top, out of 40 million, it's really incredible, are the ones that are in wide use today. Here's the same analysis for a pentatonic scale. Again, the top ones, minor Ratusan, the South Indian scale, other scales that are used in other cultures, the Bengal, Korean scale I mentioned, the major, and so on. So again, out of, in this case, more than 40,000 possibilities for a 5-note scale, the ones that come out of the top are the scales that are used today. So it seems to me a pretty compelling answer that the scales that we like and the reason that we use them and the reason we have so few of them is that most scalar possibilities don't come anywhere close to identifying human language, and we don't bother with them. We have never bothered with them. So that's the argument there. So again, let me stop, and I'm doing okay on time. Questions about that? I mean, to me, that's just a really impressive answer to the question of why we have just a few scales that we like. Yeah.
So you've reported that the Phrygian scale, the Dorian scale, and the major scale each have different, what you're calling mean percentage similarity scores.
Yeah.
And yet those three scales...
So again, the mean percentage similarity scores, you take all the notes in that scale, and in the minor pentatonic example I showed you, there are 15 non-redundant possibilities. the similarity for each one, you add them up, you get a similarity value.
Right, and yet those three scales are made up of the exact same intervals. They're played in different orders, but the composite, if you're truly adding one to the rest of the notes of the scale, they're made up, they have the same interval vectors.
I guess that's possible.
In the same way that you showed us the pentatonic scale and you added each note to every other note, it'll be the same with those, what we call the church modes in music theory. They're made up of the same intervals, they're just performed in a different order.
Yeah, I mean, that's the definition of the scale. I mean, but that's not trivial. I mean, the order is the critical defining factor. I mean, we'll come to more on scales in a minute. I mean, the defining factor of major and minor scales, which we'll come to in the last piece. It's the order that defines the prevalence of different tones in the music composed in that scale, which is a very tricky thing because scales are not prohibitive. You have something in a minor scale or a major scale, it doesn't mean you can't play the notes in the other scale. It just means you play them less and you use them in different ways.
Sure, so when you come up with this mean percentage similarity, are you weighting those notes? So that one note is more important than the others?
No. No.
So your question is how you get different percentages even though the intervals are the same?
Correct.
What makes the percentages different if there's the exact same intervals involved?
I think because each scale has different numbers of non-redundant notes. So let's go back to, I mean, oops. So here the minor the pentatonic minor. So here's a major second, here's a major second. So you have the same interval, but each scale is going to have a different composition.
But all the church modes all use all the white keys. They all have the same pitch content.
I can't speak for Western music, but in like the Chromatic system that you showed, the compositionality makes a huge difference, right? Like the order in which the notes arrive completely changes what the raga is, even though the scale might be the same.
So are you measuring them based on
No.
just intervals and not
No. Or on what?
on just intervals rather than
Just the intervals that make up that scale.
I mean just as opposed to Pythagorean or equal to.
Yeah, they're all in just intonation.
So they're in just intonation.
Just
So that
intonation.
would make a difference then.
Yeah, because the ordering of how the notes arrive on the scale will make a difference to, like, two scales will not be the same if the order of the notes in which they're played are different.
I mean, these
Those are two
scales.
different answers to this question. If I can try to answer this.
Yes, please.
I think what you're onto the correct line, which is because you're using just intonation for your intervals, that is actually differentiating the modes in a way that is incompatible with a vector analysis, which presumes equal temperament.
Right.
That's why there's a difference in the scoring, and it's a small difference because it has to do with a small difference. in
Yeah,
terms
these
of the
differences are
interval.
small, so I mean,
But
these,
that would be
you can't
the
read them, but their
distinction.
differences are small. Okay.
I would do the same thing.
Do we more or less happy? Okay. Other questions? Yeah. David?
Yeah, there's another issue here, which I published a paper almost 20 years ago called Common Musical Scales Exhibit Optimal Tonal Consonance, in which I compared the scales, much like what you did here, with all of the classic work by Malmberg and all the rest of it. Didn't use any speech. The point I'm trying to make is that this is correlational, the relationship to speech.
Oh, yeah.
You'll get exactly the same results if you just simply use the data from these different experiments about what tonal consonance is. So it's not, what you're presenting, I admit, is interesting, but it's correlational, not causal. So you
I wouldn't argue for a minute that it's correlational, but I think tying it to speech is critical because it gives a biological basis to the phenomenology.
Well, there are different interpretations.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
That's why I said not everybody's going to agree with it.
Well, I think the very fact that you start with the original speech and that you're picking the highest amplitude harmonic as your as a point of normalization all of the just intervals are naturally going to fall out of that because you're picking different points along the harmonic series. The relationship to all of the other notes will reproduce all of the things that you would normally see. And you wouldn't see that in any harmonic tone in which the fundamental was the maximum, had maximum amplitude.
Yes.
But of course, speech, because of the way speech is, it has amplitude,
Yes,
points in
right.
other.
I think you're right if I understand what you're saying, but it is a characteristic of speech and not a harmonic series willy-nilly.
Yeah, well, there are plenty of sounds that have energy in other partials apart from the fundamental, apart from speech. But you're right, it's the most common one we're exposed to.
Other objections, criticisms, questions? So the next topic here is covariation in music and speech across cultures. So again, so far the name of the game has been the commonality of worldwide music scales, interest in identifying the fundamental characteristics of speech in defining consonance and dissonance and so on. But obviously there are differences in different cultures. I said kind of trivially at the beginning that you go into a Chinese restaurant and it's pretty obvious that it's Chinese music. It's something you don't hear every day on pop radio. So what's the reason for the differences, the cultural differences? So there are many, but based on what I've said, one would surmise as a hypothesis that the difference between music of different cultures should align with its speech. That is, there should be covariation between the speech of a culture and the characteristics of its music. And that's the point of this next little segment, to explore that. So I mentioned earlier tone and non-tone languages, and let me just repeat, I think more or less what I said before. Tone languages are languages that specifically use tones, inflections, if you like, rising, falling, and falling, to make lexical distinctions. So the classic example in Mandarin Chinese is ma, and whether ma is said with 4 different inflections has 4 different lexical meanings that are completely different. Horse, hemp, mother, and I forget what the 4th one is, something equally different. So you should wonder whether in a tone language the music would be different based on the tonal characteristics that you need to employ in a tone language versus languages like English, American English, French, German. These are the 3 languages we use, and we compare them with Vietnamese, Thai, and Mandarin, 3 solidly studied and classical tone languages. Of course, there's a lot of stuff in between. With 6,000 languages in the world, they don't all fall into neat categories. But those are 2 extremes of non-tonal languages where we, in English, French, German, don't use inflections for lexical meanings. We do use them. We use them, but not so much. And but we don't. It's not that we ignore them totally. So, for example, the words content and content have 2 different lexical meanings, and it just is where we put the accent, which syllable we put the accent on. But we're not doing this every time. Every syllable in a tone language has a different lexical meaning based on the tonal inflection of the syllable. So what we did was to ask whether you could compare music of a tone language culture and a non-tone language culture and find by some metric that they correlated pretty well. And the metric that we use in this case is just prosody. Prosody just means the up and down of pitch variation over time in music, the melodic line in speech, the speech prosody that we're using all the time. I think someone mentioned earlier that if you don't have prosody in speech, you have difficulty understanding the emotional content of that speech. So there are people who have, through a stroke or some other brain injury, damage to the area in the right hemisphere that is the generator of emotional prosody. And when they speak robotically, it's very different from the people that they socialize with to take them seriously if they're saying, I love you in a robotic monotone, in contrast to the way, lovers would really say it. So the prosody is a way of asking what the correlation is between, or the lack of correlation between melodies in a culture, a tone language culture, and melodies in a non-tone language culture, and whether that co-varies with the speech prosody in the tone language and the non-tone language. So, well, again, this is just obviously simple to measure the prosody in music because the notes are specified. And there are two measures that were used in this particular study. One was the frequency of occurrence of the prosodic changes, and the other was the frequency of occurrence of slope variation. So notes going up, and here's a slope reversal going up, slope reversal. So you can, by either one of these metrics, ask about the characteristics of the prosody of music and language in a culture. So the way of doing this in speech is pretty much the same. It's a lot messier, as you can imagine, because the notes aren't identified as such. There are incidentally no musical notes in speech. I mean, lots of people have looked to see if there's some prevalence of musical intervals in speech as such, as pitch intervals, but they're not. But you can measure in the same way the prosody of speech by looking at the intervals from one stable position of pitch to another, and the slope reversals. If it's going up, how often does it go down? And over a segment of speech, a monologue, let's say, what's the incidence of slope reversals? What's the distribution of interval differences? So here are the results of that. And this is a comparison of slope reversals in tone language, non-tone language for music, same thing. Slope reversals for speech in tone and non-tone languages, and you can see that they are relatively different. Here's the same, well, not the same, but here's the same sort of analysis for the frequency of occurrence of intervals, the red being the intervals in the music of a tone language culture, the blue being the intervals in a non-tone language culture, and again, speech in a tone language culture in red and a non-tone language culture in blue. But again, these two measures co-vary pretty well. So this is, again, answering David's question. All of this is correlative. I mean, unfortunately, it's not quantum physics. I mean, we're stuck with what we have. But the argument here is that the reason for the differences in tone and non-tone language music comes from the differences in speech, or I shouldn't say comes from them necessarily, but that they co-vary in a way that's consistent with all these other arguments I've been making. Okay, questions about this? Yeah.
I think this can all be attributed to regression of the mean. I mean, it's a really interesting thing to see, but I don't think there's a straightforward explanation for it. So in toned languages, pitches tend to move because the pitch is essential for the lexical item. You have to have high contrast, so you tend to move higher pitch.
Right.
And as a consequence, it tends to take you to the extremes of the range more frequently, either the low extreme or the high extreme. And then because of regression to the mean, you're going to have a lot of reversals.
Yeah.
So, and then of course, the music itself is strongly shaped by the language. So
that's the point. The music is strongly shaped by the language.
Yeah, but it's. I mean, I think the point here is it's regression to the mean. It's explaining both what's going on in the musical realm and what's going on in the language realm.
Well, I mean, the point I'm trying to make is just that the covariation of these two things is of interest. That indicates that the reason for Chinese music sounding the way it does, or South Indian music sounding the way it does, has to do with the covariation of speech and music. Yeah.
So what do you make of the fact that the feature of speech that you're comparing to the music is pretty different across the two studies that you talked about, or two sets of studies you talked about so far? So here you're talking about tone, which is sort of fundamental frequency variation. Previously you were talking about this sort of very subtle, maybe more complex, more abstract.
Yeah, I just use prosody as an example here. I mean, you can use any other metrics, spectral metric, or any of the other metrics that I talked about in the same way and get the same answer. There's covariation in all these measures between speech and music.
Also in rhythm, too.
Well, rhythm, I mean, probably, but I mean, that's something we didn't look at.
But other people have.
Patel.
And it's,
Is what?
people have looked at least within European languages that I know of, looking at rhythmic patterns to do with French word sequences, syllabic emphasis, and German.
Yeah, I've seen those. Other questions? Okay, the last segment here. Oh, sorry.
I have a question about,
sure.
about an earlier thing with the scales. In your graph, you show 60, I think, scales, and the variation in percentages went from like 44% down to 2%.
Very small differences.
So I'm wondering, how far does it go? I mean, how many scales are in the 40s, for example? I mean, I'm just wondering. It seems. I mean, it's provocative that those certain ones are at the very top, and it seems like how many thousands have 40% something?
None of them. I mean, those rankings were in terms of similarity.
That's what I'm saying. So the similarity rankings, there was even the bottom one was still at 42% similarity ranking.
Yeah. So I mean, you mean if you bin them in some way, would you not get some that?
I'm just wondering how many are that similar that are never used or never haven't culturally.
Well, maybe I'm not understanding your question. In one case, there were 40 million possibilities studied, and in the other case, 40,000 in the pentatonic. Is that what you're asking?
Well, I'm just asking how many possibilities are actually have a similar percentage ranking.
Oh, I mean, how far down do you go to have to go to get zero? I don't know the answer to that question. I don't think you probably ever get.
But I mean, yeah,
terribly far down.
It seems like there's quite a few that are high similarity.
Yeah.
Only a subset of those were selected culturally, for example.
Yeah. I don't really answer that question. How far down do you have to go to get really?
Or do you go below 40, for example?
Yeah. I don't know. I should know, but I don't. Okay, go ahead.
I have a question about the tone language idea. And so larger pitch intervals are presumably harder to process.
Absolutely. Well, you said harder. I thought you were going to say harder to play. I mean, one of the reasons, I mean, you might ask an interesting question, which I wasn't going to talk about, which is, why 7? Why 5? Why not a smaller number or a larger number in a scale? And presumably that has to do, as you get further and further down, I mean, if you have only 2 or 3 notes in your scale, it's pretty boring. If you have 12, you have atonal music, nobody likes it. But why not a higher number? Probably because the intervals get harder and harder to play on most instruments, and people just don't like it, especially singers don't like large jumps because they're hard to perform and make them sound not so hot singers.
Yeah, that's interesting. That wasn't my question, but it's an
okay.
Interesting answer to not my question. No. But so I was going back to the tone language thing. And so tone language people, the music had larger intervals. So it's kind of reminiscent of that Dedio and Ladd paper, the newspaper. It was, I think it was in PNAS about 10 years ago, and they showed that two brain development, Dan Dedio and Bob Ladd. So what they showed is that two brain development genes, ASPN and microcephalin, which are important in the active brain development, they co-vary, so where these certain haplotypes of those genes exist on the map also exist, or more likely to exist, tone languages in those areas. So their idea is there's slight, some genetic mutation that led to better pitch processing, which led to some certain advantage of pitch processing, which led to tone languages existing in these places. So I wonder if those results showing bigger jumps in the pitches are derived from better pitch perception in general. So it also relates to higher rates of absolute pitch
well, obviously I don't know the answer to it, but I mean, in general, I think the enthusiasm for genetic bases for language in general or language differences in general are very poorly considered. I mean, I think most geneticists that you ask say, we don't really have any idea of what the relation is between a gene and a phenotype, except in a few rare cases like phenylketonuria and so on. So the idea that you're going to find a gene, even a dozen genes or 100 genes that are really relevant to language or music, I think is a fool's errand. But that's just my bias. I don't like genetics. Especially medical genetics, where everybody in the world is getting money to study the gene for autism, etc. It's not a good idea. Okay, the last segment I want to talk about here is why scales convey emotion. Remember, scale is a tone set. So, I said before, I mean, lots of people have thought about the issue of language and speech and why emotion is conveyed, how emotion is conveyed in music and how it's similar to the emotion that's conveyed in speech. What people haven't thought so much about is what that has to do with scales, tonality. They thought about it in terms of intensity, rhythm, you name it. I mean, all kinds of qualities. The tonality has been kind of left out of the picture, particularly considering the difference between a major and a minor scale, which is kind of the gist of what I'm telling you now. So let me begin by saying that emotions are really a mess. I mean, one of the jobs I had at Duke was running the Center for Cognitive Neuroscience there, and I had to sit through endless, well, not endless, but more than I would have wished to listen to talks on emotion. It's a very, very messy subject in cognitive science, and not surprisingly kind of a messy subject when you try to extrapolate that into music. And the difficulty is, well, here's an array of emotions. The difficulty is categorizing emotions in general, and specifically when it comes to music, characterizing scales that have an emotional content. So Ramesh mentioned ragas a minute ago, and well, I mean, the whole subject of South Indian music, I think, is a fascinating one, and we're fortunate to have as a collaborator Janani Sundararajan, who was an expert Chromatic singer and very familiar with all this. But let's keep it simpler. And this slide is just to make the point that of all the differences in music that are relevant to conveying an emotion, the one that hasn't really been much studied is tonality. And in tonality, it's very hard to do this because if you say, well, okay, here's a scale. Take any one of the 50-ish scales that we've been talking about. What's its emotional impact? The answer is, I don't have any idea, with the exception of major and minor scales. The Aeolian and in church world language, the Aeolian, or in Greek language, the Aeolian and Ionian. And it's really obvious, and nobody has disputed this for centuries, that major and minor scales convey, in the case of a major scale, a range of emotions that is sort of characterized by bright, happy, martial, energetic. You know, you can think of other adjectives, but those are a sample, compared to minor scales, which are characterized as dark, sad, subdued, tired, again, many other adjectives you could think of. So one way to explore the question of whether tonality is the basis for the emotional impact that leads to those descriptors of major and minor scales is to study them in the way that I've been talking about. And let me first play for you, just to remind you, well, let me first, before I play them for you, just show you the difference between major and minor scales. So here's the major scale, the Ionian mode. Here's the harmonic scale, the Aeolian mode. And here they are depicted on a piano keyboard. And there are really not enormous differences between these two scales. The difference is in the third, whereas the third here is a major interval. That means it's two semitones. The interval here in the tonal sequence of the scale is a semitone, and to a lesser degree, sixths and sevenths are involved. Again, I'll show you the analysis of large databases of music in a second. But it's mainly about thirds with some contribution from sixths and maybe in some instances a little bit from sevenths, depending on what scale you're talking about. So they're not huge differences. I mean, most of the notes in the scales are held in common. And why is it that modification of basically the third, to some degree the sixth, and maybe a little bit the seventh, why should they make such a difference? Major. So now I'm going to play the same melody played on the same keyboard, and the only difference, that's major, the only difference is the changes that I just mentioned in the thirds and sixths. Here's what minor sounds like. You'd have to be tone deaf, to use a phrase, not to recognize that these two have very different qualities that are aptly described by some of the adjectives that I mentioned a minute ago. So here is, this is a summary of an analysis of major and minor themes, just the prevalence of the intervals in major music and minor music. This is themes taken from a large database of classical music, and you see the same thing in folk music. So in the major scale, there are a lot of major thirds. This is just the incidence of the notes in a composition, and the themes of a composition. So there are a lot of thirds in major music in the composition, just the incidence of them, very few minor thirds. And in minor, this is just reversed. There are a lot of minor thirds and very few major ones. Here you can see the differences in the sixth are significant, but not as great as the third. And what we did was to compare major and minor music with happy and subdued speech, again, in terms of their tonal characteristics. And the question is, does major and minor music simply derive from the similarity of the speech characteristics when you're happy, excited, versus when you're sad, subdued, tired, whatever? And the analysis for speech was based both on single words and monologues. So we had people uttering monologues that were whose semantic content or whose content was bright and happy and whose content was subdued and sad. And we asked them to, these were not professional actors, but it's not hard for any of us to do this, to say things because we are sad or happy all the time. We can say these things very effectively as non-professionals. So we analyzed the correlation of the music and the speech, major, minor, with happy, sad. And the results, won't surprise you to know, show that whether you look at classical music or folk music, again, both of these are very large databases of music that are available on the internet. So this is showing you the, for classical and folk music, the frequency of occurrence of major and minor. And again, the red is major, the blue is minor, and you can see that there's a shift, again, following from what I said a minute ago, a shift in the prevalence of these intervals in the music, whether it's folky or classical. And here's the same kind of analysis for speech. This is single words, this is monologues. Again, red is excited, blue is subdued, and the two things are, again, correlated. So, you know, the upshot of that is different emotion impact of major and minor tone collections, probably, but, you know, it's just probable. All this stuff is correlative. It's the argument as a whole, I think, that makes the case, not any individual piece of it. Probably derives from their spectral similarity to speech uttered in different emotional states. So what is obvious in other aspects of music, the intensity, the rhythmicity, and so on, between happy and sad music, are, you know, so self-evident. In tonality, they seem to be pretty much the same, but the analysis is obviously more complicated to do. Okay, so here are the main points, and then I'll quit, and we'll have a couple of minutes left for questions. So, as I just said, I mean, I think if you take any one of these pieces of evidence, there are all kinds of ifs, ands, and buts. I mean, this is the nature of what you're given. The phenomenology of music is not the phenomenology that, for example, I know and love and vision, where the psychophysics and the data is much more rigorous. It's music and it's speech, and you have to take them for what they're worth. But here are the points that I'm trying to make. That music, as we generally think of it, is largely about tones and tone relationships. Not to diminish the value of all the rhythmicity and the intensity and the syncopation and any other thing you can think of, but music is really about tones, the use of tones, and their combination. The second point was that our appreciation of tones is based on the ecological points of human vocalization. So take it or leave it. But I think this is pretty much a biological thing, that it's so important for us to be able to identify and glean information from human speech. That is really a big deal. And it's not surprising that we would develop a sense of tonality for that basis. I mean, why else would we have it? We don't care about, you know, the frogs and the crickets and so on. We care about human speech. Third point is that the chromatic scale is clearly embedded in speech. That in itself, I think, is an amazing fact. That consonant musical intervals are those that mimic speech closely and conversely. That preferred scales are also those that mimic speech. That music and speech co-vary across cultures that use tone and non-tone languages. And finally, that the impact of different scales derives from the similarity of speech in the relevant emotional states. And I guess the theme that I began with and the theme that I end with is that aesthetics is really all about biology. Okay, I have time for a few more questions, but thank you.
We have about 10 minutes for questions and passionate debate.
Yeah.
Well, would you explain the fact that emotions in speech are recognized universally?